This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. My guest today is Ken Fichtler, founder and CEO of Gaize, a Montana-based startup that recently launched a cannabis impairment detection product.
Organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the United States Department of Transportation, many research universities have all come out and said, hey, don't try to establish some THC limit as a way to police impaired driving because it's fundamentally nonsensical. It doesn't work that way.
Ken served as Chief Business Development Officer for 4 years during the Bullock administration and is a seasoned vet of the Montana entrepreneurship scene. Ken, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
Sure. So I grew up in Florence, Montana, which is a little town in the Bitterroot Valley. My mom was a potter, so she worked with ceramics and had her work in galleries and such. And my dad was a recreation manager for the Bureau of Land Management.
So you decided to go study business over the mountains, Montana State University. Talk about that choice.
Yeah, I sort of followed a girlfriend at the time to Montana State and started in engineering actually, and found I hated engineering. I wanted to invent and I wanted to create new things. And so that was not sort of in line with what I wanted to do, I found. And so I liked the creative aspect of business and just thought I would jump into that. I had a couple of professors that I met early on in my collegiate career that sort of mentored me, and they were both in the business department. So I ended up switching over to that and took over the International Business Club, was one of my first forays into leadership, and ran that for a couple of years.
Yeah, and at what point in this process did you develop an interest in entrepreneurship?
Pretty early on. I really love, as I said, the creative aspect of everything. And so entrepreneurship looked like a way that I could create something brand new, bring it into the world, solve interesting problems, and there's potential large financial rewards attached to it. So that's all really interesting.
And early on, you were involved in some startups of your own.
Yeah.
So talk about those experiences.
Fairly shortly after I graduated from college, I founded my first company, which was a marketing firm, and learned a ton about that. I think I learned more starting that than I did in my entire time in college, but the timing was very challenging. I started that in 2008, ran it until mid-2009. That was a tough time to be getting a new marketing services company
at a time where like every firm was cutting its marketing budget. Probably.
Yeah, we had a handful of clients, but ultimately couldn't make it work.
Right.
So learned a ton. Don't regret that experience, although it was extremely painful at the time. From there, I hopped into technology. I found that I really enjoyed the technology side of building websites and things like that we were doing. So went from that into building web and mobile apps. That company did really well. My founder and I ended up parting ways a couple of years into that business, and I went to work for a company that did infrared optics manufacturing in Bozeman.
Super. And at some point in this process, you land a position in the Bullock administration, running economic development. Talk about that opportunity. How did it come to be, and why did you say yes to go from being an entrepreneur to being a public servant?
Sure. So at the time I was, as I said, I'd gone to work for this infrared optics manufacturing business, was sort of one of the people that they had brought in to do the turnaround on that company. And so when that company became stabilized, my interest waned a little bit, and I started looking around for what was next. And so I founded TEDx Bozeman with another guy. I started a nonprofit called Startup Bozeman that was trying to help startups get off the ground, did some angel investing. And then one of the things I did sort of towards the tail end of that experience in that infrared optics company was I was one of the founding members of an organization called Open Source Montana that was advocating for certain candidates that we thought would be most advantageous from a kind of tech entrepreneur perspective in the state.
Political candidates.
Correct, and in a nonpartisan fashion. So we were, trying to be very objective and looking at who we thought was going to be the best candidate for the state and for the job. And so we ended up advocating for Bullock. When he was reelected, he reached out to that group and basically said, hey, I'm looking to make a change in economic development, and do you think any of you might know someone who could be interested?
Right.
And I didn't even, give it a second thought. But then one of my mentors was like, hey, Ken, you should think about this. This could be a really interesting opportunity. And I was like, well, I'd never anticipated getting into government at this point of my career.
Yeah.
But yeah, it did look like an interesting opportunity. So I went up and I chatted with Steve Bullock and his chief of staff, and it looked really fascinating. It looked kind of like a once-in-a-lifetime sort of opportunity. So he offered me the job, and I took it and moved up to Helena, started right in the midst of the 2017 legislative session.
Right. So it has to be a massive just change on so many dimensions. You go from, the entrepreneurial space where you need to be agile, the stuff is changing every day, moving really fast, sometimes maybe too fast to, our view of government. I guess jumping into a session, things are moving fast.
Things move fast in the session, yeah. And the other interesting thing about my position, I was the Director of Economic Development, or Director of the Governor's Office of Economic Development, which is really a subset of the Governor's Office. And so I had quite a bit of leeway, actually. I was not sort of bogged down in rules and regulations like I think many state agencies are. So I definitely had enough rope to hang myself with, and Governor Bullock was really interested, I think, to see what this young guy would do with this office. And so
and so what did you do? Like, what is the jobs, like what is your charge in that role, and how did you act on that charge?
Sure. So the charge is basically to expand economic opportunity in the state broadly. What I did when I came in is I really tried to take a holistic look at what are the things that touch this job? And the answer is almost everything.
All of it.
It's almost overwhelming when you start something like that. So I saw my job ultimately as sort of cost reduction. So how can economic cost be reduced? And then also economic expansion. So that's, I think where traditional economic development typically lives. And so I really focused on a couple areas. One was creating more sort of really good paying jobs in the state, and there are many sectors in which that can take place, but I focused on value-added agriculture, technology, outdoor recreation were a couple of the spaces that I found a lot of opportunity in. We recruited new businesses to the state, so we were the state agency that was charged with leading those efforts, and we were extremely successful doing that. And then the other was kind of workforce preparedness, and so I wanted to look down the road, perhaps further than was comfortable for a lot of people, and think about what are the coming industries that we need to be focused on, and what are the things that are going to be less in demand that we should be aware that are going to phase out, and we want to be sure our university systems and other training centers are aware of these things and training people into the appropriate positions.
So give us just a quick summary of what you think those macro trends are. I'm curious, as somebody who works in the university system and tries to help students be prepared for those opportunities and maybe not locked in on the opportunities that might disappear, where do you think we're going?
I think that one of the interesting and useful things to do when you're looking far out into the future about job prospects is to think about what the intersections of various disciplines are. So you can apply, say, biology and computer science. What's the intersection of biology and computer science? And at the end of the day, DNA and biology is a big data problem, and so there's a huge intersection there. And I think there's huge opportunities to be training people into these big data sort of problems as they relate to biology. Another area that I thought a lot about was AI, and I was at the time thinking, okay, well, we've got tons of really smart people working on self-driving cars. There are very achievable self-driving vehicle milestones that we could have. So for example, it's crazy to me that we still don't have automated railways. These are two-dimensional things, right? Yeah. You're going straight in a line. So I at the time was thinking AI is going to really have a huge impact on the future of work. And I think that's correct, but I was actually focused in the wrong areas. Okay. I didn't see these large language models coming, and I don't know that many people did. I thought that was going to be a really hard thing.
So let's talk about Gaize, this new venture that, actually, when did you launch Gaize?
I launched Gaize as soon as I left the Bullock administration, so we incorporated in January of 21.
So what is Gaize? And let's start with what problem are you all trying to solve?
Yeah. So in the Governor's Office of Economic Development, one of the things that I was looking at that I thought could be extremely economically impactful to the state, it was cannabis legalization. So at the time, Montana was a medical-only state, and I thought it was extremely likely we would become a recreational state if the ballot initiative was to come forth. Of course, that has since come to pass. So I wanted to understand what's going to happen. What are the economic opportunities? What are the challenges that are going to come with this? So I talked with counterparts in states that had legalized. I talked with law enforcement, business owners, and legislators. And the thing that struck me most about this was, of course, there's these, really huge tax revenue opportunities, and it's a whole new sector of the economy that's getting created almost. But there was no device to check for impairment, which struck me as completely insane. Cannabis is an extremely impairing substance, and to not have a way to check for impairment really risks, I think, not only the safety of our roads and safety of our workplaces, but the long-term success of cannabis legalization at all.
Yeah.
If something bad was to happen, people are going to point to this problem and say, well, that's the problem. We need to roll this back. And so that struck me as a really important safety problem to solve, also a huge market opportunity. And as I learned more and more about how cannabis impairment is, how it manifests in the body, what are the kind of indicators that happen, it became really clear to me that nobody was doing it right.
Before we get to how you're doing it, how you're detecting impairment, do we know how big a problem impairment is? I'm thinking of like the equivalent to an intoxicated driver.
Yeah.
But there's other areas where it's an issue as well, right?
Definitely. One of the things that's interesting about cannabis is I think most people, broadly agree it's not okay to like drink at work or drink while you're driving. But for heavy cannabis users, the same is not necessarily true. There's this broad misconception that it's okay or it's safe to smoke cannabis and drive or smoke cannabis and go to work. The statistics show us it is not. Like, it is radically more dangerous to be consuming cannabis and driving than it is to drive sober.
Okay.
It is not as dangerous as driving drunk, but we're not talking about comparing those two as apples and apples. This is something that is objectively more dangerous by a factor of about 2 than driving sober. And so it's extremely important that we solve this problem.
Before Gaize comes along, like, how do we detect cannabis impairment?
So the status quo really for cannabis is that there is no like simple roadside test for cannabis impairment. THC lasts a really long time in the body. It's called lipophilic, so it binds to fat cells in the body and it's slowly released over time. There's also been many studies that have tried to quantify some amount of active THC in the body that can be correlated with impairment, and all have failed. So what that means is that you cannot simply measure THC in the body and derive the impairment being experienced. And so organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the United States Department of Transportation, many research universities have all come out and said, hey, don't try to establish some THC limit as a way to police impaired driving, because it's fundamentally nonsensical. It doesn't work that way.
So the need seems obvious. What is your solution here?
As I started looking at the research that was out there, I really tried to go back to first principles and understand what are the things that we know are working today.
Yeah.
Is there a way we know we can check for cannabis impairment today? And the answer was these drug recognition expert eye tests are reasonably accurate ways to determine whether or not someone is impaired on cannabis or other types of drug. And each drug category has a unique way in which it manifests in eye movement changes.
Okay.
And so I was like, that's super interesting. I wonder, how could we do these better? How could we remove the subjectivity and human error from the equation? And the solution I came up with was, what if we put them in a VR headset where we could precisely replicate the light conditions and the eye movement that we need in order to do these tests?
Okay, so virtual reality
headset,
okay.
Yeah. And then I was like, well, okay, that would work, but how do we get data out of that? And so I was like, I wonder if there are headsets that have eye tracking sensors. And sure enough, there are. At the time, there were just a couple, and now there are more headsets that have really high quality eye tracking sensors. And so what the conception that I had was, I wonder if we could automate these tests in a VR headset, capture data using these eye tracking sensors,
right,
and then evaluate that data on the back end using machine learning to understand whether or not someone is exhibiting these signs and symptoms of impairment.
We'll be back to our conversation with Ken Fichtler after this short break. A New Angle is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and UM's College of Business. Access to capital, broadband, and education are 3 ingredients any community needs for success.
This is Meg Oliver, CBS News correspondent, and you're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with Ken Fichtler, founder and CEO of Gaize, a startup trying to figure out cannabis impairment detection. So, great idea. How do you then take that hypothesis and validate it?
I started by trying to watch everything I could about how cannabis works in the eyes, and there's just frankly not great data out there about this. There are some studies that had sort of poked at the issue, but didn't do a great job. There were this sort of long-standing history of use by the law enforcement community of using drug recognition experts to try to discover and classify impairment. And so I talked with cops basically, and I said, "Hey, are these things real? Like, how do they work? Tell me all about them." I found the training manual online, so I read the whole training manual. Basically, just tried to consume everything I could, and I really felt like I got to comfort that these were reasonably accurate, that we could make them more accurate using this idea that I'd had, and that this was something that was technically achievable with current technology.
How do you then get data to then go to law enforcement and say, hey, this thing works better than that human you've trained to sit in that seat?
Well, Montana tipped into recreational cannabis, and so we were able to capture some small amount of data using that. But the reality is we needed a ton of data.
Yeah.
Based on sort of the statistical analysis that we'd done on our small amount of data, we needed about 350 participants in order to be pretty confident that we could do this and do it accurately. So that meant a clinical trial, and not just a clinical trial, but the largest clinical trial that had ever been done on cannabis we were going to have to do.
And we should say that administering cannabis to a research subject population is a challenge. It's legal recreationally in Montana, but still a Schedule I substance at the federal level.
Right. And so anytime you want to do research on cannabis in the United States, you have to still get a DEA license. You have to buy your product, your cannabis, from the federal government via, at the time it was only University of Mississippi, and their cannabis was about 6% THC. So fundamentally not representative of what is being consumed on the open market. Mm-hmm. And so the answer that we came up with was, well, we have to go to another country. So we ended up going to Canada. I found a great research partner there, and we hired them to basically run this clinical trial. And so we, went through all the appropriate regulatory steps in Canada, Health Canada approval, ethics approval, all that. And we had our participants consume recreationally available cannabis that they had purchased. And we basically measured their eyes when they came in sober and then got them high. And we measured their eyes 4 additional times over the course of their high. And so what we created is the world's largest data set by far of cannabis-impaired eye movement.
Mm-hmm. And what did that show you?
It showed us that the indicators of impairment that we are looking for certainly exist, and we can certainly discover them using automated methods such as statistical analysis or machine learning. And so we've now built those algorithms out, and they're working great. What we also found, though, was a lot of new indicators of impairment that I believe are completely unknown to science.
Okay.
And so we're crafting some academic papers on those right now, and I am really excited to bring some of these to light. We actually found better signal in other parts of the testing process than we were supposed to based on what law enforcement currently looks for.
Interesting. Now you've got data, but you've also got a question of, I assume you just can't take this data and go to the Montana State Police and say, okay, buy my headset.
Yeah.
There are some constraints on what law enforcement at various levels can contract with, right?
Definitely. So there are a couple different layers of approvals that we're still frankly working on. The first is the International Association of Chiefs of Police has a task force basically that looks at new technology that would be deployed into the DRE process. And so we've talked with many members of this task force. They're reviewing it, and hopefully we'll get to a good outcome sometime soon, although they move sort of notoriously slowly, so it could take a while. The other side is Food and Drug Administration. Has not typically regulated impairment detection devices. It's sort of a new category of thing. It looks like in order to sell to law enforcement for use in the roadside, we'll have to have FDA approval for that. And so this is a process we're just beginning.
Yeah, and as an entrepreneur trying to get something off the ground, I mean, you've got a hardware question that's somewhat solved. You've got software. You've got data collection, FDA approval. Like, this sounds like a venture with a long runway and that's pretty capital intensive. How have you confronted that?
Basically, what I set out to do early on in the company was raise some capital for this, because I'm not going to self-finance, a lot of money in order to do this clinical trial and build the product out. I tried doing that. I frankly failed pretty hard for the first couple months.
Wow.
It was...
Even though you're pretty networked in that community
I'm super networked.
Venture funding, angel investors here in the state of Montana and beyond.
This was a hard problem. It's business type that doesn't look familiar. So a lot of venture funds are just like, it's not B2B SaaS.
Yeah, that's out of our lane.
Yeah. And then for other investors, you're talking about doing a clinical trial. You're talking about government approvals, selling into government, brand new product category, brand new product type that has never been developed before. So there's a lot of these risk factors that sort of all compound to be like, wow, this looks really scary and hard. And sorry, but we're out. So it took me a long time to raise capital for this. I ended up raising $1.2 million. We closed on that in March of 22.
Okay.
And that was from, a handful of angels who I think were brave and saw the vision, and I'm eternally grateful to for, helping bring this thing to light.
Super. So you have some runway. You have, this law enforcement customer base that involves a bunch of hurdles. But there are other customers, insurance companies, corporations. Talk about some of the other customer segments and where you're at with those groups.
So there are many industries that have these sorts of workers, and examples would be construction, manufacturing, oil and gas, energy, utilities, transportation, logistics, shipping, etc. What we are doing right now is taking our product to these customers and looking for the ones that are sort of tech forward and excited about this or experiencing extreme pain from cannabis impaired workers,
right?
And selling the product into those sectors.
And so you launched the product relatively recently, right?
Right.
And you're able to sell into these segments. What are your most promising segments to date?
It's been interesting. My theories about who's going to be the buyer of this thing has changed pretty dramatically over time. And, I still want to solve this law enforcement problem. I think that's the most important thing. And we'll get there. But what's become clear is we're going to have some intermediate steps before we get there. And so, selling into these commercial customers is certainly the right first step. And so what's emerged actually is that drug testing services companies are the ones that really seem to, one, understand the product and the problem that we're trying to solve. They face this every single day.
So this is a company that, like, a business contracts with to do drug testing on their workforce.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And so they typically contract with many dozens of businesses or hundreds or thousands and say, we'll deal with any reasonable suspicion. So if somebody they think is impaired on the job, they can come test them. They can do some random surveillance type testing. They can do pre-hire testing, things like that.
Okay.
So these companies really intimately understand the problem that we're trying to solve. They get asked every single day by their clients, what are we going to do about cannabis impairment? And they have to every single day say, well, we don't know. There's no product that exists for this yet. And so they really are excited and understand what we're trying to do and why. And so our product being kind of a rapid portable screening product is also really useful for them. It's kind of a whole new business segment that they can spin out. So really what we're creating, I think, that's interesting is this whole new way to think about drug testing within an employment situation.
Sure.
So it's distinctly retroactive right now, where you're testing for the presence of a substance typically after an incident happens.
Yeah, after something bad has happened on the job. Yeah.
And so with Gaize, you can screen for impairment and know if someone is fit for duty before they even start for the day, and do so rapidly and with no additional testing fee.
Just from an ethical standpoint, I mean, what you're describing could be described as a big brother or sort of, surveillance by the state, et cetera. So how do you kind of address that? Not necessarily criticism, but that bit of pushback.
It's definitely a concern, and that's something that, I wrestle with every day. I don't want this to turn into a mechanism for surveillance or for precluding someone from living their life. And in fact, I think it does the opposite. So the way I've come to comfort with it is that with Gaize, someone can go and responsibly use substances on their own time as long as they come to work and are ready to work and can work safely. We're not capturing anything that is sort of intrinsic to the person. So we're not capturing blood or urine or saliva or whatever. We're not capturing breath. We are strictly looking at eye movement and how your eye movement can change as a result of impairment. And so this is something that, is captured on video 100 times a day and you don't even realize it.
Okay.
We're just taking a closer look.
Ken, this business is fascinating on so many levels. We talked about the challenges to getting it off the ground. We've talked about kind of the ethical quandaries and legal quandaries that you're kind of navigating. In the near term, how are you kind of defining success? What's the next milestone that you're shooting for?
Good question. Having just launched, the biggest thing that we're driving towards right now is our first sort of handful of customers. We've got our first handful, I guess. So we're going for kind of the next tier, and it looks like they're going to be companies that are in all of our target sectors, which is really exciting.
Awesome.
There's not a single target sector that is not interested in what we're doing and doesn't see this as a good potential tool to help keep their workplace safe. So that feels incredibly good.
Super.
The challenge right now, I think, is this being a brand new product category and a brand new use case for trying to keep a workplace safe. How do we answer all of the myriad legal questions around how it can be used in each jurisdiction, and do so in a timely fashion so that we can actually drive revenue and build this company?
Yeah, how do you make it go? It's fascinating, Ken. I applaud you for taking on a hard problem with a bunch of public welfare implications. If folks want to learn more about Gaize, potentially if they're interested in becoming a customer, or I'm sure you're probably looking for employees in this great state of Montana, where would you point them online?
Our website is Gaize, GAIZE.ai, and then you can find us on all social media at Gaize Safety.
Super. Well, Ken, good luck, and thanks for coming in today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. A New Angle is presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business, with additional support from Consolidated Electrical Distributors, Drum Coffee, and Montana Public Radio. Keely Larson is our producer. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. Editing by Nick Mott, social media by AJ Williams, and Jeff Neese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.